Shabbat Shalom. So, I've already told you, this Shabbat is Parsha Shemini. In it, we get the infamous and extremely disturbing story of Aaron's two sons, Nadav and Abihu. These two die upon the altar immediately after making their sacrificial offering. The beginning of the parsha outlines certain sacrifices. Aaron, the high priest, they all do everything explicitly and perfectly, and the sacrifice is just completely burnt up and consumed in its entirety. Then it tells the two sons' story. Then it veers toward more rules and commands by God, and then it oddly circles back around again to the devastating story. Aaron's response to his son's death is silence. Utter and complete silence in the face of God and in the presence of everyone. It's puzzling to many, and there's a lot of commentary that has been written about this. Two dramatically different sacrifices are presented. First, Aaron, as the high priest, he complies in explicit, excruciating detail with what has been commanded for the priests to do as to their offerings, both in the preparation of the offering and in the execution of the offering. The people are then blessed for his effort, and it is written, "Fire came forth from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering." The people are struck with fear and awe. They shout in response. They grab down on the floor. They bow down. And then, in the famously mysterious passage, Aaron's son, both of them, the sons Nadav, which means actually gift or donation, remember they're making an offering, and Abihu, which he is my father, they bring an uncommanded offering. Remember, Aaron's was commanded, an uncommanded offering of incense. And a fire came forth from before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before God. And in response, it is written, Aaron is silent. Why would God do this? How could this happen? And how could Aaron, the father, respond with total and complete silence? The most common theory is that they made the offering uninvited, and also that there was some type of strange incense, which maybe there was that too, who knows? Because we don't know exactly why, but it is thought that it had something to do, a connection with idolatry. Others muse upon the fact that actually maybe they were just intoxicated. Whatever the reason, even more disturbing than their death seems to be in most of the commentaries the fact that Aaron was silent. It prompts much discussion then about death, mourning, behavior, and when it's actually good to speak and when it is best to remain silent. A parallel is drawn to Yom HaShoah, which is next week, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and it always falls in the Jewish cycle several days after the time this parsha is read. How could so many during the Holocaust turn a blind eye and remain silent when horrific acts of abuse, violence, and murder prevail? Parallels are drawn throughout time towards this parsha and current events. So look at what we're facing within our own country, around the globe. Look what's happening in the Ukraine. Look what's happening in Israel and beyond. How can any of us remain silent in the face of brutality and loss? And yet, Aaron was. He must have been utterly shocked, maybe unwilling to anger God further, possibly by his reaction, unsure how to behave or even how to proceed in the face of such loss. This is a big moment. Everyone's making their offerings, and his two sons were just burned up and consumed by fire and killed. Or maybe he just needed his own time to process. And oftentimes, public people have a very hard time because they have to process their mourning and their grief and life's things publicly. And maybe he didn't know how to handle this and he wanted to figure out what to do. The text is used as an example for situations where there are no words one can offer, like for a grieving parent who has lost a child. And then other instances when some things are just better off left unsaid. It takes great courage and effort to remain silent when sometimes all you want to do is scream. So my granddaughter has selective mutism, and so she doesn't speak at school. She tells us all what to do, paro, Shabbos, everything else. She knows she has an extensive vocabulary. It must take enormous strength to stay silent all day long. And sometimes she just wants to scream. When she gets home, you've got to let it all out. You just got to scream. But there's something in there that's going on that they have to address as to, is it anxiety? Is it performance anxiety at 3.5? But look what the world has done to us all in COVID. But we have to remember that we don't know what's going on in another person, emotionally, psychically, physically, and we need sometimes to give them this space to be silent. And sometimes we have to just be willing to sit with them in the silence, just to offer our support, to say it's okay if you don't want to talk. And that's what happens here. That's one of the lessons when we look at why was Aaron silent, and so much is written, but maybe the lesson is to learn, and that's why it's related to grieving and loss and mourning, to just be with someone and sit in the silence, or let it be okay if someone wants to be silent. Rabbi Alexis Roberts' commentary on this states, in this story, there is no possibility of asking, is there a God who would do such a thing to innocent people? In this story, it is God who does it, and we are left to ponder. It is too easy to think Nadav and Abihu deserved to die. This was not just simple justice, but something far more mysterious, nefarious. Sometimes inexplicably violent fire breaks forth and destroys what we hold precious for no reason that we can never understand. It is useless to indict God or to imagine God is so limited as to be incapable of such action. Many lost their faith in response to the Holocaust, and who can blame them? But nowhere are we promised that we will not suffer, or that we will be given to know what God is doing and why. We are only told to do all we can to hear and respond to God's teachings about how to live lives of blessing and peace. The fact that something hurts and confuses us does not mean there is no God and no justice. It just means we are hurt and we are confused, and we have the choice to become bitter or blaming, or to keep asking how God would want us to respond, and try to gather the courage and the willingness to live like that. So when you look, as I've shared with you, and I did this today because of the Parsha, the story of my granddaughter in preschool, you know, she's 3.5, going to be 4, her friends are 4, turning 5. She's not talking, but somehow she manages to be at the center of everything, and she's happy and smiling and all the pictures. They have to learn how to respond to her at a very young age. They have to figure out how to include her when she is silent. And she has to figure out how to still be her best and highest self in a situation where maybe she doesn't have the words. They literally get stuck and they can't come out. When we think of Mashiach, when we open the door at our Seder, we are welcoming in Elijah for the perfect world to come, for peace. And once again, that world isn't going to come unless we choose to be good. So like I said, I tried to say to Ella, you don't want to become bitter. You want to be kind. You want to understand that maybe they just don't understand or they're having a bad moment. And this is what we have to understand. We don't know what Nadav and Abihu did. But we do know that we probably shouldn't pass judgment either on them and their actions, or even on Aaron's silence, or even on God. It always comes down to the fact that we have free will and we have choice. And in order for Elijah to enter and peace to come, it is up to us to manifest that peace in our world. Nadav and Abihu made some kind of choice that we'll never truly understand, or the consequence of which they incurred by their actions. So as we go through this Shabbat, let us think about all of the choices that we make. When do we choose to remain silent? And when do we speak up? When we don't, and when we should. When we haven't, and we know maybe we should have stepped up. Let us think about how we coped with maybe a very deep and disturbing loss and how we processed it, and maybe even how we moved on. There are no guarantees in life. There are many, many things we will never have answers for. And maybe that is the point. We need to be willing to dwell in the silence to find out, and then to maybe find God. That's what we're doing in the meditation class. Please come, and you can always still join in. We're meditating on the Aleph Bet and making that connection. Let us not be afraid to speak up loudly when it is needed and be willing to shout out against injustice, and let us learn to be silent when the situation commands and respect that silence. Kain Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will. Shabbat Shalom.